Good morning, class. I am wanted to touch base with you on this last part of behavioral objectives. It just seems like we never have quite enough time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this out of my way so I can see. There we go. All right. So we were talking about behavioral objectives in part one of this week, and I just wanted to give a short overview of some of the things we've already discussed. And one of those is each objective, you have to have at least one objective that reflects these three domains: the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domain. We discussed the fact that affective domain was really about behavior, so which is also the most difficult one to deal with sometimes, because it's easy to test somebody on their skill level in a lab or in a simulation. It's easy enough to give them a test, or maybe even to do questions and answers, but sometimes it's hard to judge on behavior, and that's one of the more challenging ones, but that needs to be part of the objectives. We also discussed the ABCD model, which was what, who, what, under what circumstances, and how well and to what extent, to cover the areas of who, what, when, where, and how, because we ultimately want to get to our what, our why. We also discussed SMART measurements. Every objective should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So this is just to help you focus. I mean, honestly, you don't have to use this, but in our field, we use acronyms all the time, and this helps us remember things. So if you think about it, if you're going to write an objective, the first thing is it's specific to your goal. Second thing is, can I measure it? Because sometimes what happens is people will write something that sounds really good, has nothing to do with their goal, and it's not measurable. Third, is it achievable? Because if it's not achievable within the time frame that you have set forth, that's why it's time bound, you run into an issue of not being able to accomplish your goal, and then it becomes frustrating. But that's also why you do a gap analysis and the SWOT analysis, to help you identify those issues and sort of hone in on what you need to do as to the relevancy to what you're doing. We also finished up with how things should connect. Starting from the top, you have the university mission, the school, the program. All of these missions should be accomplished, or at least your part of that mission should be accomplished through the program goals, objectives, course objectives, and then unit instructional objectives. So what we're working on right now is a unit instructional objective, which has to do with behavioral objectives, which feeds into the overall course objectives in terms of your understanding and application of educational methodology. That feeds into the overall program objective of, as part of your leadership training, to have a well-rounded understanding of the entire leadership process. Because what a leader does often is they lead by example, but they also, as part of that, teach, whether it's formal or informal. And I think that's why understanding these educational methodologies is important. Then I gave you the Rumba test. Again, just another acronym. Don't have to remember it. It's just something kind of to keep you. It kind of goes along with the SMART. I like the SMART better, but this is a test that you can run on it. Is my objective relevant, and is it functional towards the goal, and is it achievable? Is it understandable, measurable, behaviorable, achievable? Again, all of this Rumba test is not as good, I don't think, as a SMART, but just to give you another way to look at it. All right, so for the new information, what I want to draw your attention to is that you're writing objectives. So make sure when you're writing objectives, you start with, and I said this on Tuesday, make sure you're using that taxonomy. Pull it out. Here it is. And you can actually, you can look these up on the line too. So use the terminology to help hone that objective. So if you want a student to Do you want a student to understand disease management, or do you want a student to develop a care plan to manage a specific disease? Two very different objectives. One is at the bottom of the scale at 2, understanding, and the other one is at the top, which is you're going to create that plan. Maybe you want them to revise that plan. And that may be an objective. You want them to be able to not only create a care plan for asthma, but you also want them to have the ability, the student will have will be able to revise a plan based on the assessment of that patient. You may want them to modify it, which is kind of the same thing as really revise, obviously. And that's typically the terminology we use in respiratory. You want to be able to modify a care plan. Again, remember what I said on Tuesday. If you can create, you can do the rest of this. So set your goal high, or set your objective high, which is at least probably at the 4, 5, and 6 level. The 1, 2, and 3 level would be more applicable to a patient, or to a new student, or to a very young staff member who's just getting started. So these were the cognitive domain. This is the one way you can look at it as far as what you want to do. But it's a little different when you're talking about the psychomotor, because in this case, you're looking at terminology, and I'll go to the creation level up here at the organization. So when you say design, that's a skill. You have to physically do something. So to be able to design, they also have to be able to cognitively understand how to design. So the who, what, when, where, and how, but more importantly, the why. So you can look at the various different verbs. So if you think about down here at the bottom, perception is more equivalent to remembering, just a basic understanding. You want them to be able to at least recognize. Recognize is an action verb that requires them to do something. How would they recognize? In other words, you write the objectives from that perspective. How do they recognize something? What skill, what test would you give them to recognize that? Well, that's pretty simple. You give them a written test. That would be, they could recognize vital signs. I'm just giving you an example. So there are a lot of different ways you can look at this, but the psychomotor domain is, where do you want them to be along the scale of that level? So you want them to be able to organize. Yes, that's what you want to be. You want them to be able to adapt. And answer, of course, is yes, because you want them to be able to adapt or reorganize information and revise and move along with care plans. Correct. So again, the top 3 levels here. Affective domain, again, sort of the same thing. What's the behavior that you want them to have? So when I say you have to have one objective for each of these domains, quite honestly, if you think about it, you're looking at each domain should be present within an objective, is probably a better way to put that. So for example, if you want them to be aware, which is a behavior, it's also is something they can do. They can recognize it, correct? So how do you measure that affective domain? So in other words, you really want to be able to measure each of these domains within the objective that you write, because it's not like we're going to write, and we might, and this could happen where we would write one separately, but it could also be, within the same objective. Generally, when you talk about COARC standards, and we're talking about goals, and we're talking about evaluating students, we're evaluating them on 3 different levels, those 3 levels: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. But when you think about writing an objective, there's an attached behavior to recognizing or performing something. And then there's also a cognitive level of understanding that they have to have. So you're really sort of integrating all of them into one objective. The point is that you have to make sure that it's not just focused on being able to, students will be able to suction a patient. That, okay. That's pretty simple, right? That's a definite psychomotor skill. Does it require cognitive abilities? Does it require a certain behavior when they're performing that? Well, you could write a separate, students will be able to, trying to think how to word that now. Now that I've got myself stuck on psychomotor, I'll think about it later and we'll get back and we can talk about it next week. How about that? I don't want to take up too much of your time here. Okay, so we use computer simulation a lot in respiratory therapy education, and you probably still use it if you're in the hospital. So computer simulation is one way to do it, and other things. I think I mentioned that I use this a lot in their second year. A lot of times, we would use those disease maps and mind maps. We would develop groups. We'd work on simulations in groups, and as a singles, we would have discussions in class. Their entire second year, we spent doing simulation after simulation after simulation. Instead of doing it by topic, we did it by disease state, but we covered all the topics that was required for the course. It was a lot more fun that way for the students, and because they were in clinical, they were applying it, so it made a lot more sense to them. The second year was always so much more I guess, eye-opening for students because they were putting this information to practice. So computer simulation, or you could create a low-tech simulation to do the same thing. But getting them involved together and also making sure that they have ownership of the material, as I mentioned before, ownership of the material is really important. Having them read a chapter just familiarizes themselves with that information. It doesn't actually get them to understand that information. You have to get them engaged in some activity. So yes, these are both psychomotor skills that they're implementing, but that's also cognitive and affective because they have to be able to do what? Get along with people. They have to display the right behaviors. They have to then, what you're doing is you're challenging their cognitive level of training by engaging with other students, and they will all be much better off because they're going to learn from each other. Okay, so here is from an instructional design perspective versus a learner perspective, sort of going back to the different levels of the Bloom's taxonomy. So in an event, classroom discussion maybe, when you do a lecture, you're gaining the attention of the student, correct? As an instructor, the learner perspective is they want to focus their attention on the learning task. In other words, they want it to be relevant. Remember the why. That's in the second part. So they want to know why I'm here and what I'll learn. So your job is to inform the students of that objective or those objectives. The other thing is they want context. So in order to give them context, you have to do what? You have to be able to bring that into the real world, but also as an instructor, stimulate that recall of the prior learning because they may not connect the dots from what you discussed last week, which is why I kind of always go back to what I talked about last and bring it to the first part of the discussion. And you can read the rest of this, but going all the way down to number 9, help me turning my learning into real world results. That's the creation level. In other words, that's what they really want to do. They want to know the why, but they also want to get to what? They want to actually get to doing. And that's really important for students, as you know, as a student. The instructor's job is to enhance retention and transfer that to the job. So when I say writing is important, and I focus on that and people don't understand it, maybe I didn't do a good job of making you understand that as a leader, whether it's in education or in management, you're going to have to be well versed in how to communicate in writing because I can guarantee you people will misinterpret what you say all the time, even if you are perfectly clear. So writing is one aspect, and it's also probably one of the more important aspects in our field because this is what keeps you out of court. in many cases, or helps you win a case when it comes to somebody maybe who has a behavior issue and you didn't document or weren't clear in your writing. They will either win their case against you, and or you have to put up with that person because you didn't do a good job of documenting. Documenting is not just about writing things down. Documenting is about writing things down clearly and where you can communicate to someone else in your absence. I was hoping this would show up better, and since it doesn't, I might have to let's see if you can read it. Hopefully you can. It's a little bit fuzzy for me. This is just a different view of what we just talked about. It talks about what's going on in terms of information. So, one way to get somebody's attention is to say, "Hey, you," right? And that stimulates or activates receptors in the brain because now I'm talking to you. You're paying attention. That's a very simple thing. All right, so let's go to the very top because that's where we transfer the information. We will now do it on the job, right? Because what you're doing is effectively by writing and creating is that you're in essence simulating what you would be doing on the job, because that helps you in the retrieval and generalization of the learned skill to the new situation. So you're learning, and many of you don't have the educational background, or I mean, when I say that, you don't have the teaching background, and it's a little frustrating, I'm sure. So just be aware that the whole process is about learning and to get to to complete the journey, but not necessarily have it at the beginning. If you had it at the beginning, you wouldn't need this class. So just be patient with the process, and as we go through each of these projects, you're building a greater resume of information that you can look back on and say, I did that. Lastly, I wanted to just bring out this one topic that we'll discuss probably a little bit more next week, and this will be on Tuesday of next week, is the ADDIE design. I mentioned this in part one, and I love the ADDIE design. It's sort of the combination of the SWOT and the GAP together, or you could actually use it as part of this. But if you look at it, it's very similar to the SWOT and the GAP. The difference is it sort of brings everything together. And the ADDIE design, the acronym is analysis, design. Okay. Analysis, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. So it spells the word ADDIE. That's where it comes from. So what I like about this is you'll notice that with the ADDIE design, the whole idea is to analyze your problem. You could do that with a SWOT, or you could do it with GAP. Then you design a program to solve the problem that you identified in the GAP or in the SWOT. You design it, you structure it, then you go with further development. But along the way, you're always evaluating, does this apply to what I'm doing? That's why you do the SWOT and the GAP. Lastly, you'll implement, and then once you implement it, you test it out, then you evaluate it, and then you go back to the drawing board. And this cycle continues and continues and continues. So this is very commonly used in business and in education. But again, this is sort of the third part from the SWOT to the GAP to the ADDIE. I don't really utilize the SWOT and the GAP because that's what I'm doing during the analysis. I'm really using those, but I'm not calling it that. And then the design and development process is pretty straightforward. Once you have your information, the input's there. Now you want, okay, how do we solve this issue? After we're done, we want to implement it to see if it works and then evaluate it. All right, so that's all I have for this section, and this wraps up that chapter, wraps up this week, and hopefully you're well on your way to your this project for this week. And if you have any questions, just give me an email. Talk to you later. Bye.